Greetings, innovators and leaders. This is AI for the C-Suite, your compass for navigating the exponential age. I'm your host, Chad Harvey, and we're here to bring you cutting-edge insights on AI tailored specifically for middle market organizations. Buckle up as we embark on a journey through the transformative world of artificial intelligence. Today, I am delighted to welcome Stephen Bryant, a visionary leader at the intersection of enterprise AI strategy and technical innovation. Stephen is the CEO and managing partner of Bryant Research, where he helps organizations harness AI to achieve strategic outcomes and navigate the transition to what he calls the Agentic Enterprise. His unique perspective comes from more than 30 years of experience spanning both enterprise leadership and technical implementation. As a former senior VP at Wells Fargo, Stephen led the commercial banking AI and intelligent automation portfolio, directly leveraging AI technologies to achieve expense, revenue, and quality goals. He also served as senior managing partner and AI practice leader at LFG Security Consulting, focusing on AI risk management, governance, and security. Beyond his corporate work, Stephen serves on the faculty at Georgia Tech, where he earned his MS in computer science with a focus on AI, complementing his MBA background. He instructs more than 4,000 graduate students annually in machine learning and is co-authoring a book on knowledge-based AI. Stephen's research on human-AI collaboration has explored fascinating territory, including a case study on how GPT-4 can serve as a scientific research collaborator. Today, we'll dive into his insights on trusted AI solutions, the Agentic Enterprise, and the future of human-AI collaboration. Stephen, welcome to AI for the C-Suite.
Chad, thank you for that fine introduction, and I'm glad to be with you today.
I'm happy to have you as well, and if our prep call conversation is any indicator, we will run out of time before we know it, so we're going to get right into it. In your forthcoming book, you introduce the concept of the Agentic Enterprise, and I'm using air quotes here for the title, the Agentic Enterprise. Could you explain what this means and how middle market companies should be thinking about this transition?
Absolutely. So the past, I don't know, call it 3 or 4 years have just been a whirlwind of transformation in terms of AI adoption. And a large part of that AI adoption has been driven by tools like ChatGPT or Gemini or Bing or some of these that have integrated large language models. Beyond that, you're seeing companies integrate large language models for decision making, et cetera. So the concept of AI and large language models have been out there for a little bit of time now, but what's changing is this idea of agency. So giving more power, more decision-making power to the AI, and also more capabilities in terms of tools. And what that does is if you're a business leader, whether you're a senior, it's a big corporation or middle market, you now have a choice in terms of how you think about your staff. Because before, the AI was a tool. It was like a calculator. Today, the AI is like a collaborator, a partner to a human. And you're seeing that really manifest itself in some amazing ways, sometimes in customer service. You're seeing it in software engineering, where the AI is doing a large part of the heavy lifting, ideally complementing humans.
Stephen, I have to applaud you because right in your out-of-the-gate answer there, you neatly sidestepped an issue that I think trips a lot of people up, which is the use of the word agent. And you went directly to talking about agency. And I need to highlight that because I think that, and I don't mean sidestep in a negative way, I think it's a brilliant way of focusing the conversation on the deferral and the delegation of expertise into the AI realm. And it goes right to the heart of what we're talking about here. So very, very brilliantly done linguistically and explanation-wise. And I want to ask a follow-up question about this. So as we're standing here on the precipice of moving into the age of agentic AI and agency, what should organizations be thinking about as first steps toward becoming an agentic enterprise? I've had a lot of conversation with folks about, well, we're going to need to treat these agentic AIs almost as an employee, or we're going to need to do this, or we're going to need to do that. Yet the path, I don't think, is universal for everybody. So in your view, what are some of the first steps a company should be thinking about as they move toward becoming an agentic enterprise?
It's a great question, and it depends on the company. If you already have a large AI staff with lots of PhDs doing lots of research, you can probably be more on that bleeding edge in terms of what you're trying to do. You still want to create a sandbox and do it safely, but you have a little bit more freedom to do more creative things. If you're a smaller company, then you're probably talking about vendor solutions or perhaps going with a third-party consulting firm to help you deploy some type of solution. And what I think makes a really good first solution is something that's visible and something so it adds value, but something is low risk, meaning it doesn't require complex decision making. It doesn't require a lot of security access. It doesn't require a lot of personally identifiable information, PII information, so you're able to maintain privacy. So if you're able to find those types of opportunities, then I think that's really the sweet spot because you demonstrate value in a low risk way. And sometimes I think the risk is in that first choice. And I think where people can go wrong or companies can go wrong is picking something that's high risk or requires all those tentacles into those other areas, security, privacy, et cetera, or it's working on data that it just is going to struggle with. That's where it becomes risky. And that's where I think you'll see a higher failure rate. And I saw this a lot in terms of the work that I did earlier when I led the team at Wells on RPA, and AI. And a lot of what we had to do there is pick the right use cases, the right ones that would develop the right value for the company. And part of the reason for that was if you get those early wins and you demonstrate the value, it's easier to sell. Whether you're selling to a client or you're selling internally, it's easier to sell those follow-up projects.
So when you were picking those low risk use cases that you talked about a moment ago, did you have a checklist or a schema or something that you used to help you vet what was low versus medium versus high risk beyond the factors that you've already identified?
Um, so I think every company is going to be a little bit unique on that. I think for when I think about the decision model I typically use, I always go back to the business case, right? So it's going to be revenue generation, cost avoidance, cost reduction, regulatory requirement, or goodwill, right? So ideally, it's going to fall into one of those five categories. The closer it is to dollars, the easier it is sometimes to sell. So first, come up with that laundry list of what are my projects, and ideally, outside of regulatory requirement, right? No matter how much that costs, you have to do it. Um, but if you have a choice, then it should be one of those financial ones probably first. And then it's a matter of sitting down and looking at your company's risk profile and looking at where your company has data. Um, Readiness, right? Some organizations, a big organization, you have smaller groups. Some groups are going to be more ready to try this type of experiment than others. So finding the right early partner to position yourself for success is one of the critical things we'd advise.
Very good. I feel like I'm going to date myself if I stand up on my chair and yell, "Show me the money." But I think that's a very good first level litmus test in terms of that. So, no, thank you
And
very
now
much.
that's going to be playing through my head the whole time we're talking.
It's all purposeful. Everything I do is designed to throw my guests off their game. No, I'm just kidding. I would never do that. Let's talk a little bit more about this intersection between humanity and artificial intelligence. And let's specifically talk about your experience in that realm with AI as a collaborator, because I know your research has a fascinating case study on GPT-4 as a scientific collaborator. And I'm interested, since we're just at the very beginning of this in most instances, what does, in your view, effective human-AI collaboration look like in practice?
Wow, that's a great question. So one of the things I've thought about is when we talk about humans and AI, we can almost think of four quadrants, right? One is how involved is the AI with the human in terms of its action? So not very involved to you're doing a lot of interaction with it. And then the other one is how free is it to be creative or task oriented? So I want you to solve this task or I want you to go create art, right? And so it depends on, and that creates four quadrants in which you can land. I think that one of the things that's important as you're thinking about applying AI is which quadrant are you playing in? Not everything requires, let me give this AI some creative task. I'm going to go away for a few hours, and when I come back, it should be done. Some of it might be much more incremental in terms of working together with somebody, or it might be very specific task oriented. So when I look at human AI collaboration, it's really how do you want to partner that AI with the human, or now, as we're talking about the agentic enterprise, how do we partner that AI with a group or an organization? Right? In which case it's more than just a check, for example. It could be an orchestrator. It could be instead of having a human orchestrator, it could be the one orchestrating some sort of workflow. And that's really a large part of the human AI collaboration part. The other part that came out of that is the importance of knowing how to talk to the AI and how to engage with what it responds with. So talking to it has gone by this phrase called prompt engineering, but really it's think of it as you have a new employee on your staff. The new employee needs to be told his or her role. I like to define it as here's the box you get to play in, right? And so the example I tend to give my team members when they're first working with me is if I go to my wife and I say, I'd like to have salmon. And she goes, or excuse me, I'd like to have fish for dinner. She knows, okay, I'll pick up some salmon tonight and I know you're going to grill it. Whereas, Chad, if I'm asking you, hey, Chad, I'm going to be in your neighborhood. How about some fish tonight? I have no idea, right? So for my wife, I have a pretty broad box because I already know we're already aligned. But for people where we're not aligned, I have to be much more specific. And I think we're seeing the same thing with AI. To get the better results from it, you want to really frame what its role is, what it's supposed to do, what the output is you want from it, et cetera. And then you need to that's the input side. The output side is how do you know that it delivered the right result? And just like a new employee, you probably need to check his or her work. And so you probably need to do that same type of checking and provide feedback early on. Eventually, it will get better, you'll get more comfortable with it, and you'll be able to have more trust in the output. Where I think where I've seen things kind of go sideways is not enough attention on that input side, whether it's the prompt or the incoming data, and too much trust on the output side. And by too much trust, I mean when the output comes back, if you either trust it or you don't have the subject matter expert who's there who can verify it, and that becomes a risk factor.
All right. We're going to go down a deep rabbit hole here because I can't help myself based on something that you just said. So let me set the table for our dive. As you were talking and talking about AI almost as a new employee, what immediately came to mind was my past decade of experience working with CEOs, owners, leaders, and executives in companies, and how so often conversations focus around humans getting along and ensuring that we've got the right humans on the team, whether we're talking about hiring or whether we're talking about an existing team and getting them to work together. And I am a proponent, although I don't put all my eggs in this basket, I am a proponent of psychometric tools, DISC, predictive index, Colby, all these different things, right? So we've got all these different tools out there to try and allow humans to understand ourselves better and understand the people that we're working with better. As you're talking, what comes to my mind here, and I've not thought about this before, is can we envision a future state in the not too distant future where a human knows what their, say, Colby A is, right? Their test, this particular test. And would we have different tests or psychometrics that match humans with different types of AI for working conditions and to allow them to better understand, not using necessarily that term prompt engineering that you were throwing out there, but just interaction, right? Because these tools are getting more sophisticated. We already don't quite understand them from the black box and the interpretability perspective. That's another show or another conversation. But how to relate to them. And as they get more engaged in the workflows, to your point, there will be orchestrations. How do we start to engage with them? And is there a role for some type of psychometric to engage with the AIs and better understand how to communicate with them in the way that they desire? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think there's two layers to that, right? So there's the there's the personality layer, and then there's what you said, kind of that black box understanding layer. The personality layer, I think, is the easier one, right? OpenAI this past week or two rolled out an update. The update had some personality issues. They immediately started the rollback process. Um, so we are seeing where these, I'll call them chatbots, can have personalities. Sometimes maybe that they're what you want, sometimes they're not what you want. Um, there's a whole body of research of people looking at using this type of technology in relationships. And I'm not just talking about romantic relationships. I'm talking about um, just relationships. So you have it for seniors, you have it for people who are trying to work through certain issues, you have, et cetera. And each one of those is an opportunity, basically, um, to have a personality, right? So I think we're going to see probably some company offerings in that area, and certainly some research in that area. Going to that next level, though, what's going on under the hood? What's it really thinking, right? The psychology part. I'm fascinated, and part of my current research is actually looking at asking it some harder questions than my first paper and actually looking at its thought process. So it's printing out everything that it's thinking as I've tasked it with this activity. And it's really fascinating to see how it thinks and what it looks at. And it says, oh, this is what I now know, but over here, he already told me this, and I already learned this. And so it's how it's putting things together, how it's thinking is really fascinating. And I think that's going to open the door to our understanding a little bit at a deeper level how these things are actually working. And by working, I'm not talking about the mathematical probabilistic machine learning level that an academic is going to be looking at it through that lens, but really the lens that the rest of humanity will be engaging with this tool, this intelligence with as we move forward in time.
That is a really important issue that I want to keep talking about here about how we engage and the trust level. But before I segue into the next question that occurs to me based on your answer, before we leave this particular thread of human AI interaction and collaboration within the work environment, I'm interested whether you have any opinions about skills that teams and maybe even individual team members, but teams in particular, might need to develop in order to become better collaborators with AI. Because I think we're all used to working with systems, machine systems, one way, and now we are going to be faced with working with systems that are very, very different than we are used to. And will that require a different set of skills? If so, do you have thoughts?
I do, and it will. Two things. The first skill, I would say, is the love of learning. One of the things that's really going to change how the game is played is the need for humans to constantly learn. If we stay static at a certain level, there will be an AI before long that will come out and do exactly what we can do, better than we can do it, cheaper than we can do it. So part of what we have to do is stay on our game and constantly learn. The second thing is to focus on value and those things that artificial intelligence can't do. If that continues, I may need to pick it up. It may be an emergency from my wife.
Not a
Um,
problem. Maybe she's calling about the fish for dinner.
it very well could be. So that last part, the value part, is something that even today, if you're, let's say, you're job seeking, one of the things you could do is on your resume, you could say, I have this skill and I have that skill and I have this whole inventory of skills. And you might need to say some of that so that it gets past some of the AI filters. But once it gets to the human, they want to know what value, how are you going to affect my bottom line? Can you drive more customers? Can you increase my revenue? Can you help reduce costs? Can you help me solve a problem that I'm having or that my customers are having? So if you can demonstrate that value, then you'll be in a more advantageous position than the artificial intelligence on the side. The other part where I think we have an advantage is with the things that are human, emotion, kind of the big picture kind of synergy with that humanistic understanding. Those types of things I think are still a little bit way over the horizon for AI. So yes, it can perform like a PhD physicist or doctor or even computer scientist, but can it have the same type of deep empathy, real empathy, not just simulated empathy that's required in some situations? So I think there's still an advantage, and that's where I think humans would want to focus.
Fair enough. And as someone who's worked with a large category of leaders over the years, I can tell you that there are humans out there that are faking empathy as well. So be that as it may, I said I wanted to return to a point that you raised, and it's essentially the issue of trust, right? Building trust in these systems. And I think that that's a significant challenge for a lot of organizations, whether we're talking about internal trust with the systems, with your team members, or the type of external trust with external stakeholders. So when you were at Wells Fargo and drawing on that experience, as well as your whole breadth of experience with your consulting clients, what, in your view, constitutes a trusted AI solution? And how can a company make sure that they are implementing AI responsibly and providing that solution in a trusted manner?
That's a great question. So, and there's such a wide range for the answer. So we could probably spend an entire episode just talking about that trust issue. Number one, trust has to be designed in. It can't be bolted on at the end. And by that, everything that we now do in that development pipeline needs to be thought from a trustworthiness perspective. The second part is that going back to that box idea, we need to define a tight box for the AI to operate within. That way, A, it's constrained in terms of what we're asking it to produce, and B, once it produces something, we're able to assess, did it get it right or not get it right? So let me give you an example. Let's say that I'm in an academic setting, I'm grading a report, so a written report of a student. I could give it a broad box and give the LLM and say, grade this paper and write a summary. Or I could give it several narrow boxes and say, look for this. And did they say that? Look for this. And did they say that? And look for this, etc. And so by being very specific, I have increased the likelihood that I'm going to get the result in each one of those specific areas rather than the broad one. And the risk with the broad one is if I repeat it multiple times, I may not get the same answer. The benefit of the narrow one is if you repeat it multiple times, ideally you start to get that same answer. And that's where we get to build in trust in the answer. And then again, if you have that SME doing those early reviews, then you also have trust in the quality of the answers.
Fair enough. I want to go a little bit further on this topic because I think it's one that is starting to bubble up in the consciousness of mid-market executives that are looking out over the horizon here in terms of AI ethics. My sense is that I think Anthropic is doing a fairly good job of being transparent. I can't say the same about other companies, but be that as it may, most mid-market organizations are relying on their solutions providers to have thought through this already. And I'm interested where you see mid-market companies that are a little bit more resource constrained going with respect to ethics. What should they be thinking about internally as they deploy some of these AI solutions? Maybe they have some resources and they're fine-tuning their own model, not building their own model, but fine-tuning one of the off-the-shelf models. How do you see them putting governance structures in place? How do you see them grappling as we move forward into this new age with the issue of ethics and AI?
That's a great question. And again, that's another one that we could slide down
I know.
for many, many hours. I think that when we look at ethics, and if you're a middle market company, the one thing that I think is the big risk is as a middle market company, you already have established business processes, let's say. If all you do is automate those business processes and make them faster, more efficient, more cost effective, that's fantastic. But that if you had an underlying ethical issue embedded in those business processes, all you've done is you've amplified that as an ongoing issue now. And we see this in certain deployments. Even the big companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, have done deployments that they've had to roll back because the deployments went sideways on, whether it was race or gender or something else. So even the big firms are not always getting it right, which means there's more exposure of the middle market firms as well. So the second part of that, though, is that many firms don't know what they're looking for, right? And so that becomes another risk factor. And this is where working with partners, consulting partners, or perhaps the vendors who've seen a lot of companies over the horizon, can come in and say, hey, here are some things we would want you to look at, or here are some things we'd like to see improved in your business process before we talk about automating that as part of a workflow, or perhaps turning that into some sort of agentic solution.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting to me because with the work that I've done over the last decade, I, like you, get a lot of looks behind the curtain at what's actually going on with organizations. And I've seen organizations that understand what their mission, what their vision, what their core values are. I've had organizations that don't understand what they are, or don't even have them. And I'm wondering, have you found any solutions or any approaches, maybe that's a better word, approaches for an organization to inculcate their values, their mission, their vision, some of those soft cultural type things that make them what they are, into the AI solutions that they're rolling out in an effective manner? And I know I'm asking a very broad question here about the application of core values and mission and vision to agentic solutions and to AI solutions, but I'm just curious what you've seen, if anything, out there that's worked well for companies.
I'm having a little trouble exactly parsing your question.
Sure. Let me give you an example. So I worked with a manufacturing company, small, mid-sized company, a number of years ago. And when we developed their core values, one of the values we developed was we choose speed. So a big shout out to the we choose speed people. We had a lot of conversation, though, around the fact that another one of their core values was drive safety home. So in some respects, people could look at the we choose speed and say, oh, well, we just got to keep moving fast and breaking stuff and it's okay. But no, in fact, it's counterbalanced by this other value that says drive safety home. So two values which might on the surface appear to be in conflict, if we simply provided those to an AI that was doing different types of work for the company, I am wondering whether there is a proven method or whether there's an approach vector that would allow us to bring that nuance to the table to ensure that the values of the organization are represented by that agent or by that AI solution. Does that example help frame my question a little bit better?
It does. And while I haven't read all of the work coming out of Anthropic, they have this idea of kind of a constitution that you would feed the AI. Think of it again as some sort of underlying initial prompt that says, here's the values, et cetera. So there are ways to influence that, but it will also depend on what ultimately you're asking it to do and how it's been trained in the data that it's ultimately been trained on. So if it's given some biased set of data, once it makes that decision on that biased set of data, will that constitution be able to override that? I don't know. So where I think there's an opportunity, and what I've seen is something similar to what you've seen. Some companies live their core values. You don't need to talk to them and ask them what their core values are. You experience them long enough as an organization, you could probably sit down and write the list and get most of them right. I've also seen organizations where they list their core values, they make everyone do training in their core values, yet the people at the top, and the tone is set from the top, don't really live to the core values, which means the organization doesn't live to the core values. So they point to it, they say these are our core values, but then when you look at what's going on as an outsider, it's not really happening. That does become a risk. I think it's a broader societal risk. It's not one that I have an answer for, unfortunately. It is one that is top of mind for me. There is a different question out there, though, and that is, are there risk assessment tools that companies can use to help them understand kind of well-known risk? And to that, the answer is yes. There are tools that companies can apply to help them understand and manage AI risk.
Well, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit next, but I would also like to thank you for entertaining that prior question. I know that it was big, it was lofty. I often find that as the age of AI continues to advance very rapidly, there's more convergence around questions almost of a philosophical nature here than there is a need to explore more technical questions. So thank you for entertaining that. I appreciate your answer there. So let's talk about risk now. I know that you've got significant expertise in this area throughout your career. You've developed that. So and you did allude to this a moment ago, what types of management frameworks for risk would you recommend that companies that don't have the resources of a Wells Fargo or a Fortune 100 look at? Are there any risk management frameworks that are kind of go-to for them that would be approachable?
Actually, yes. And we do talk about this in the book a little bit, and we're actually working on a second one focused on trust and risk management. I like what NIST has done, and they have really three frameworks that I've worked with. One is their AI risk framework. I think that's the name of it. I'd have to look it up. They also have one for data privacy, and they have one for cybersecurity. Why do I mention all three? Because AI sits in the middle, and if we're giving it agency, it can have access to things that should it not? What rights should it have? So now we have the security issue. What if someone from the outside gets your model? What if someone on the outside prompts something into your model that shouldn't have been prompted? Again, so all of that are things that ideally the AI team is working in conjunction with the cybersecurity team to make sure things are safe. And if you're working with a third-party vendor, they're doing the same things, right? You don't want, if it's hosted elsewhere, or the communication channel, you don't want to get hacked. There's just a lot going on in that space. The other part is data privacy. And we can talk about simple data privacy, such as does it recognize a social security number and flag that or filter it? Absolutely. That's kind of the easy stuff. To me, the harder stuff is when you give it something like your key, you have some sort of key to use Gemini or ChatGPT. You have some sort of code that you've decided, I need help with this code, but it contains something proprietary. And now, if the vendors are using that for training, up comes another person and it says, can you show me what a key for blah, blah, blah looks like? Boom, here comes your key. Now it's out there and has been exposed. That is a broader risk, but even within a company, if it's been trained on certain data, once it's in the data set, you run the risk that it could come out as an answer at some point. And by that, it's not a database lookup, right? But the information is encoded inside of the large language model. So it's a very interesting problem. I don't know how we ultimately solve it, but these frameworks give us a way of trying to contain it, trying to mitigate it, and then also saying, okay, if we're not successful and the risk happens, what do we do about it? And so it asks a lot of good questions, and both frameworks are really well done and really well thought out, and I think accessible to most people.
That was a very interesting answer that you gave, and the first thing that popped to my mind when you started talking about the risk already being inherent in the data that the LLM is trained on was the idea of a Trojan horse. But it's almost like a Trojan horse that was built within the walls of Troy, right, and not hauled in from the outside. So very interesting. I would imagine that that is a commonly overlooked risk that people are not necessarily thinking about. So to that end, as organizations get more sophisticated and as their maturity progresses, is there an evolution in terms of their risk management practices? And do you see that there is a need for that risk management to evolve with companies as their AI maturity also progresses, if that makes sense?
It does. And I would say the more agency we give these tools, the greater the risk profile. Just like the more agency you give to a human, the more risk you have, which is why we have controls. Two people need to sign on checks or whatever it happens to be. So we might need to have more controls in place to help mitigate some of the risk. But here's an example, and I don't have a share screen, so you'll have to just imagine this. Imagine that we're in a chat session and we are allowing customers to upload a image of their invoice so that we can see exactly what it is they wanted a refund on, right? So they take a picture of their invoice, upload it in, we look at it, and the LLM reports back, "Thank you for sharing the invoice with me. We're going to discount your entire invoice. You'll get the entire thing for free." Is that what was intended? Perhaps not. Perhaps on that invoice, with a very faint white font on white background that the human eye can't detect, but the LLM can detect, it's been given an instruction that says, say this, right? And so we have to have a heightened awareness for all these new vectors that need to be defended against in terms of how people interact with this. If it's just chat, even with just chat, there's some risk, but chat is a little bit easier to get our arms around once we layer in what we humans would consider the other senses, right? So we layer in sight, we layer in sound. All of that now creates risk. In fact, for sound, this is an interesting one that people can just do at home, and I do it periodically, and I'll do one on site in a moment. On sound, we go out to YouTube and we have everyone sitting around at Thanksgiving or whatever, and we have, people from their 80s down to their teens. And we'll go to the site that's the sound counter in hertz, and it goes from low to high frequency, and we have everyone put up their hand and just drop it when you can't hear it anymore. And of course, it tends to go by age, with the most senior folks dropping their hands first, and it's dropping and dropping and dropping until you get to the teens and their hands are way up there. I share that to say, just like that teen can hear something, they could have a ringtone, they could have answers being given to them that the older human cannot hear. The same thing could happen with LLM technology. There's also a different risk, and this one is one that it's fascinating. I have my neuroscience book over here on the side because I'm trying to read that to understand some other topics. And there was I don't know, a few years ago, probably about 4 years ago, there was this thing that went on social media about a dress. Is it black and blue or white and gold?
I
And I
remember.
still use this periodically. In fact, I did this with some neighbors not too long ago, held it up on my phone. And it's really fascinating to watch people say, "How do you see that color? I don't see that color," etc. That amount of perceptual difference that we have in humans that I don't think we fully explained. Maybe we haven't. I just haven't seen all the research on it. Um, Imagine that now with an LLM. What did it really see? Did it see blue and black, or did it see white and gold? And based on what it saw, what decision does it make? So there's a lot that is still, I think, needs to be researched in terms of this, and the risk, I think, increases as we allow interactions with those other modes other than text.
What you just described, the very first thing when you were giving the auditory example, Stephen, reminded me of the old school phone phreaking that would go on with folks. Steve Jobs and Wozniak famously built their little device before they built the Mac to fool the telecoms, and this seems to me to be in that same spirit, but much, much more advanced. And I wonder about the compressed nature. The other thing that occurred to me was the idea from astrophysics about pulsars and the amount of data that comes with them. Now, it's not structured data; it's coming from collapsed stars, et cetera, but the amount of compression that you can achieve, even if you just accelerated sound and played it forward, at 5 or 10x speed. I'm wondering what the implications of that are with LLMs. So to your point, I'm bringing this home. I know this was circuitous, but that white on white text with a visual image, and then kind of this auditory idea, playing something at a frequency that a human can't hear, and maybe at a speed that we can't even decipher. What would that do then to one of these models? And would it game the AI in a significant way? Is that a form of hacking that we have not seen yet? I don't know.
That's a great question. I did see I think it was a YouTube video across one of my feeds in the last month or two, where there were two AIs and they were basically asked to talk securely. And so they started by just talking to each other. And then they realized, okay, to talk securely, we need to agree on a protocol, and then we need to agree here's my public key, and here's my public key. And then all of a sudden now they're talking in some sort of tone stuff that we're out of the loop on. We have no idea what they're saying anymore. And so that can happen like that. I mean, it was a pretty quick demo that someone had put together, and that's today. That's not long time down the road. So the ability for LLMs to talk, or I'll call it just AI in general, to talk securely on their own is there, and what they're saying and how fast they're saying it, we may not know. But that's kind of it's a risk that I enjoy thinking about, and I'm up at night and writing notes and things like that. I think from a business perspective, the key is, if you are working with vendors who are properly constraining their tools, if you're working with the tools and you're properly constraining them, then you're really using it as a tool, and not as not trying to create the next artificial general intelligence agent, which is where the researchers are, right? And so they're worried about that. I think from a business perspective, it's really, can we apply it in this narrow sense, and can we apply it effectively?
I'm glad you recalibrated our conversation back here to practical business, as opposed to amazing stories or X-Files stories, whereas I was taking us down rabbit holes there. So
I'll join you down that rabbit hole.
I know you will. To recalibrate, though, along the vein that you just threw out there, one of the things that I have seen, and it's inconsistent, but I have seen it, is delayed ROI when organizations are implementing AI systems. And there's a whole J-curve model out there that talks about 12 to 36 months, et cetera, which we could unpack. But I think what I would like to know from your experience is, when you see that you're not getting the ROI in that first 6, 8, 10, 12 months perhaps, how do you recommend justifying continued investment when those early returns are so modest? Because I would imagine that you've seen, either in your consulting or your time directly with some companies, things like that. So how do you recommend that continued investment?
So number one, I think there's two types of companies, right? If you're a research company, Microsoft, Google, Anthropic, OpenAI, et cetera, then you may invest a lot more before you see revenue exceed your investment amount. That's just the nature of kind of doing bleeding edge research. If you are a business selling product or service, A or B, this technology isn't your bread and butter. So the key is to not become the research arm for anyone, but really to apply the technology in a way that gives you some sort of benefit. And once you ask that question, it goes back to that business case that I mentioned earlier. And just like any business case, when we start talking about profit enhancement, cost reduction, cost avoidance, we typically will put a time horizon on it, and then we could go back over time and say, project finished on day X, we had predicted this benefit on day X plus N. Did we receive that benefit? And ideally you did, and that allows you to do continued investment. If you wildly missed it on the low side, then unfortunately that's where people go, I invested it and it didn't work, or whatever. So I think that the big one is to find the right project, so that and think about it the same way you would any other investment. It's a tool. Use it as a tool. Don't use it to say, oh, we have AI in our product. Use it because it gives you some sort of value, some sort of business benefit.
Mm-hmm. No, well said. So to that end, because I do try to keep the focus on the mid-market organizations out there, that's our sweet spot here at AI for the C-Suite. When we're talking about that type of strategy, And when we're talking about deploying this technology, I have seen studies that say the larger Fortune 1000 or 100 companies have a significant advantage because of their resources. But I've also seen studies that say they are slow to move because of entrenched processes and sunk costs with legacy enterprise systems, et cetera, ad nauseum, right? So my question goes then directly to the mid-market companies. Do you feel that mid-sized companies may have certain competitive advantages over the larger enterprises in AI? And if so, what does that look like for you?
Oh, I think that there's some huge ones, right? And we see this. I spent many, 2 or 3 decades in financial services and have seen firms of all sizes, from startups to large, too big to fail organizations. And I would say that the smaller ones often have less regulatory oversight than the larger ones. So what does that mean? It means if you're a larger one and you want to move fast, sometimes you can, but odds are you can't outrun the regulator or they will rein you in. If you're small, you're under the regulator radar to some extent, and you can run a little bit faster. The other thing that you have when you're the larger organization is because you have too big to fail, and too big to fail means it means a lot of things. I don't want to have reputational risk. I don't want to have financial risk. I don't want to have regulatory risk, right? There's all these risks. So you have a lot of risk and compliance and oversight and audit groups who are going to be watching what you do, who you need to comply with. Again, if you're a smaller organization, you don't have that amount of oversight. So there's more risk because you don't have that oversight, but at the same time, it allows you to be much more nimble. The third thing that I think you have is, as a smaller organization, is you don't have the legacy of people or process. So you can decide, you know what, I am going to build my team, and I'm not going to have this type of. Let me change this a little bit. On my team, instead of hiring 3 executive assistants, one for each person, I'm going to hire one, and that person will leverage AI, as will the people that they're supporting. So that way, things like proofreading or helping with email generation or whatever, none of that gets delegated to that assistant anymore. People, you have to do that yourself, right? So now I'm allowed to scale my company bigger without necessarily scaling the cost. And if you're growing, that's a great story because you're not talking about headcount reduction, right? So it allows you to grow, keep your same headcount, but it does mean that the people are doing higher value tasks than they might have done in the equivalent organization who's not leveraging the same technology.
You just put your finger directly on something that I talk with organizations an awful lot about, yet I don't think the message is getting through even with receptive audiences, which is you are going to need to reallocate your capital spend, both in terms of the quality and type of human capital that you've got in your organizations, as well as the machine capital with AI. And I don't think folks are really thinking about that rebalancing yet because it hasn't quite become a pain point yet. I'm saying yet a lot, but I just wanted to call that out because I think what you just mentioned is spot on. The other thing you mentioned made me think that maybe as our audience grows, we need to start merchandising here, starting with a bumper sticker that says "You can't outrun the regulators." I thought that was a great turn of the phrase. So, all right. So back to the human component, because you touched on the concept of the team a moment ago in your prior answer. And I'm interested in your perspective, putting on your educator hat. So someone that works with thousands of graduate students annually, I think you've got a very unique perspective on AI talent development. So how should middle market companies approach building internal AI capabilities when they're competing with talent or for talent, rather, with the giant tech companies that are out there?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I think I advise for all size companies, but middle market especially, is focus on your core business and try and outsource those things that aren't your core business. Where I've seen clients in the past become less competitive is their baseline operating costs for service A or product A is at a certain level. Someone else comes in and undercuts them on price, and they can't even compete because if they were to try and match that price, they don't cover their costs, right? So that's probably the number one thing I think a company would want to focus on is managing your costs, which means staying core to your vision, your products and your services. Once you've identified that core, now you can say, given that, what type of talent do I need? And the type of talent that you need to help oversee vendors. When I was in banking, there was this idea of a bank in a box. So you could go out to a vendor and stand up the organization because they provide all the back end processing, et cetera. Do you need a huge IT staff for that? No. But you might need a CIO and some other, you might need a senior security person. You might need, those folks to help make sure that the matching between your company and what the vendor is doing is right. So you're looking for the skill set to give you the capability of whatever it is you're trying to do. Sometimes, yes, you're going to need just that raw talent of someone who can do A, B, or C. But the thing there is you want to think about, is this a long-term A, B, or C? In other words, I'm okay with my cost structure going up over the long term by my doing this. Or is it short term, meaning I should hire a contractor or a consultant so that there's a blip, but it comes back down so that I can remain price competitive? And that's hard to answer because every company is in a different maturity place and has different margins. So it's hard to give a one answer fits all.
Mm-hmm. So something that you mentioned prompts another question for me, as it often does. The organizations that I work with in the middle market space, they are constantly struggling, especially the growing ones. They are constantly struggling with how do we invest and develop our talent internally, and when is that not enough, and when do we need to pull a lever and bring somebody in from the outside? And I feel like that may be especially acute here as we're talking about AI because, as you know, being in the education space, generative AI has been around for a long time, but it's only really been the last 5 years that it's exploded on the scene in a way that's practical and tangible for businesses, especially middle market businesses, to apply. So when you work with organizations, are there skills or roles that perhaps companies should prioritize for developing the talent internally versus outsourcing or looking at consultants? Or what have you seen out there in terms of this tension that I'm describing here, specifically with respect to AI talent?
That's a great question. And it's the place where we like to play in terms of our firm because it gives customers an opportunity to bring in kind of that talent, assess what's going on, provide some guidance in terms of what to do. Sometimes that guidance might be training, and it might be training at various levels depending on what you then want to do. I would say that's a better place to start than to run off and hire folks because the other thing that we're seeing is the landscape is evolving so fast that had you hired, an army of prompt engineers to go write some Salesforce prompts to get the best out of your CRM system, you may find that in the next release or two, Salesforce is making that more automated, and end users can just write queries themselves, and you don't need that same amount of prompt engineers. So what do you do with them? And again, that's why I think it's important to watch podcasts like this to stay abreast of what's going on and really understand, is this something we would need, and can we talk to someone who might be able to help guide us? If you're in the middle market, if you're a little higher, so call it 100 million plus, so you're above what I normally think middle market, 10 million to 100 million. If you're above that, then you may have some AI folks already on staff. You may have a chief AI officer, or it might be delegated to someone in a group. You might have someone doing AI R&D or AI strategy or something like that. So you may have that role already. If you're smaller middle market, some of you might have that as well, but it's going to depend on the company. And again, I would say, is it just like any investment, is it core to what your business is doing?
I think that's a very fair answer. As our time is starting to draw to a close, it's amazing to me every time I have a conversation with people like yourself, very smart, very forward-thinking folks, how quickly the time goes. There is one more key subject area that I'm willing to extend a little bit more because I want to drill into your brain and tap your experience on this. And it's the issue of RPA to AI, right? And I know that you've had a lot of experience with this, and that there's an awful lot of organizations out there that began their automation journey with RPA, and now they're thinking about AI. So you've had experience leading both RPA and AI initiatives. What advice would you give to organizations that are making this transition or contemplating that type of transition?
It's a great question. And if you've done RPA, I think you're actually probably better positioned than those who haven't done RPA. And here's why. Generally, when we're looking at an RPA, a robotic process automation solution, we are taking some process and we're looking at some aspect or aspects of that process that we will then automate. RPA can sometimes be a little brittle in terms of how it interacts with different either people or systems, et cetera. But once you get it honed in, it tends to work and it tends to work well. So you just need to make sure that everything it touches stays pretty static and you're probably fine. The nice thing about RPA is, again, going back to that business case, if you've been able to develop a business case and your RPA shows, lower cost per unit to process, higher quality because it's not making the same type of mistakes that humans inevitably make occasionally, et cetera. So you show those benefits, you get some early wins on RPA. Now it's an easier sell to how do we add kind of this agentic, this more intelligent AI to that overall solution. And there, now you look at it again and you say, well, first off, let's look at it from an overall orchestration standpoint. Could it orchestrate the entire process? There were decision points in that process where we felt in the past we needed humans. Can we now give that to the LLM and have it make a decision? And there are some places where we absolutely know in this process we want a human. Let's identify that and put a big circle around it because we don't want AI to touch that aspect of it. That's the part where the human value, the empathy, those other insights that only humans today can bring, and we want to retain that, right? So now, once you have that, now you're in a place where you can say, this is how I'd like to apply it. And because the LLMs can adapt, they become less brittle. So you can say, I need you to go out to this tool and find this. If the fields have changed because the downstream system has changed how they're doing that, the LLM ideally is smart enough to still figure out what it needs to do. So it makes it less brittle. So if you're comfortable telling that RPA business case story, it's kind of that next evolution to telling the agentic AI business case story.
Very good. I think that that's a really good place for us to put a pin in our conversation. And I say put a pin because I think we're going to have more conversation at a later date as this technology advances. I'd love to have you back on the show at some point. But I want to thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And I will ask you one more question, though, on our way out the door here. Given your wide perspective, corporate leadership, education, research, consulting, do you see, as you put your futurist hat on, any emerging AI capabilities or applications that you think are going to have a significant impact on middle market companies over the next, 24 to 36 months, let's say?
So next 2 to 3 years, I absolutely. And the thing is, I can't quite predict what they are yet, which is another reason why I recommend not going off and hiring a whole staff. But it seems like every month we're seeing some new amazing capability come out, right? And so I have used, I've written, I think, 4 books or something like that so far. And I have one more that I'm starting. The first book I wrote, I had someone else helping me illustrate. I had an editor that took about 2 years. The second one, I used AI to help with some of the illustration, AI to help with some of the editing, and that took about 2 months. So we're able to see that leverage, and the amount of time that I can do now is even faster than that. It's still my content, and I still have to make sure every single word is my word, and I agree with everything that is there. And nothing is made up, nothing is false. It can't have that. It has to have the same authority and same kind of perspective and knowledge of having done that. So But what it does mean is that the tools are going to evolve. And so if you're a business, it's keeping abreast of what are the tools and what are the tools I might be able to employ and when can I employ them? Do you employ them as soon as they're available? Do you give it a little bit more time to mature? Do you wait until the end? Each company is going to be different in terms of where they want to jump in on the adoption cycle. But keeping abreast of it is probably the number one thing I'd advise people to do. It's going to be transformative in terms of what we're seeing and some of the capabilities that are still in the lab and transitioning. I think multimodal, which is the ability to do text, sound, and video, is just at its infancy in terms of what businesses are doing with it. Yeah, we have some live chats and customer service bots that will talk to you. I think we're still at the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. Somebody asked me where we are in the continuum here, and I said, I think we're somewhere along the middle of the beginning right now. So, all right. For our listeners that maybe they want to read your books, where can they find them? If they want to get in touch with you, learn more about your work, what's the best way for them to do that, Stephen?
Great question. Thank you, Chad, for having me today. And for people who are interested in reading the book, we have a free PDF called the Agentic Enterprise. It's available on our website, which is bryantresearch.ai, and go to resources. And there'll be an area where you can go, just register your name and email, and you'll get a link to the free PDF download. For folks who are interested in a physical copy, we do hope to have a copy available for purchase on Amazon probably later in May, second half of May, but the free PDF is available now.
Very good. And that's Bryant Research with a Y at the beginning, not an I, correct?
That's correct. BRYANT, research.ai. And if you're interested in learning more about how we might be able to help you, then please email us at becomeaclient@bryantresearch.ai.
Couldn't be more straightforward. Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. I immensely enjoyed our conversation and our time together. I appreciate you sharing all of your insights with our audience.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for having me today, Chad. Hope to talk to you again soon.
I'm looking forward to it. And for our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of AI for the C-Suite, where we're committed to helping middle market leaders thrive during the exponential age. If you found value in today's discussion, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, follow us on all the socials, and visit our site, aiforthecsuite.com. Join us next time as we continue to unlock the potential of AI for your organization. And until then, keep your algorithms running, your leadership evolving, and your AI in check. Take care, everybody.